You really thought you could walk into my city and play king, boy? Detective Holden Davenport sneered, leaning over the defense table. His breath smelled of stale coffee and unearned power. Look at you. Just another statistic in a cheap suit. Maddox Fairchild didn't flinch. He adjusted his cuffs, his dark eyes locking onto the corrupt cop. The trial isn't over, detective. It is for you, Holden laughed, walking away. What Holden didn't know. The man he was railroading wasn't a nobody. He was the director of the FBI. The oppressive heat inside Courtroom 304 felt heavy, thick with the scent of polished mahogany, old paper, and predetermined fates. Dust motes danced lazily in the single shaft of harsh afternoon sunlight that managed to pierce the high, grimy windows of the municipal building. At the defense table, Maddox Fairchild sat with a stillness that bordered on statuesque. He wore a simple, unbranded charcoal suit intentionally chosen to look like a desperate, off-the-rack purchase from a discount store. To the untrained eye, it screamed public defender budget. To an expert tailor, the invisible stitching would have betrayed a $1,000 origin. To the room, he was Marcus Vance, an unemployed drifter with a fabricated history of petty insubordination and bad luck. To the rest of the world, he was Maddox Fairchild, the youngest and most ruthlessly calculated director the Federal Bureau of Investigation had seen in 3 decades. Beside him, Ophelia, his court-appointed defense attorney, was a portrait of frantic anxiety. She was young, barely 2 years out of law school, her desk scattered with highlighted legal pads, disorganized manila folders, and half-empty cups of lukewarm water. She kept pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of her nose, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the prosecution's insurmountable pile of manufactured evidence. Maddox felt a brief flicker of pity for her. She was an earnest, hard-working woman trapped in a judicial meat grinder, completely unaware that her silent, imposing client was currently evaluating the structural integrity of the entire district's legal system. "All rise," the bailiff droned, his voice devoid of any actual reverence, practically sighing the words. Judge Mira entered, her black robes billowing slightly as she dragged her feet toward the bench. She had the tired, bored expression of a woman who had long ago traded her judicial oath for political convenience and early weekends. She didn't look at Maddox. She rarely looked at the defendants in her courtroom. To Mira, they were merely paperwork to be processed, minor obstacles in the path to her afternoon scotch. "Be seated," Mira muttered, shuffling a stack of files and adjusting her microphone with a screech of feedback. "Let's get this over with. Prosecution, your opening statement." Lorelei Yardley rose from the prosecution table like a viper uncoiling from a rock. Lorelei was a woman carved from raw ambition and ice. Her designer suit was immaculate, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with rhythmic, intimidating precision as she approached the jury box. She possessed a striking, predatory beauty, her sharp features set into an expression of practiced, righteous indignation that played perfectly to the gallery. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lorelei began, her voice a purring instrument of persuasion that immediately commanded the room's attention. "You are here today because the fabric of our society is held together by a thin blue line. When that line is attacked, when our brave officers are assaulted in the line of duty by men who have nothing but contempt for the law, we must act with decisive, unforgiving fury." Maddox watched her carefully, his face a mask of stone. Textbook, he thought. Appeal to raw emotion, establish the infallible sanctity of the police force, and immediately dehumanize the defendant. He didn't write anything down. He didn't need to. He was currently logging her every word, cross-referencing her statements with the exact federal perjury statutes she was actively violating. Lorelei pivoted on her heel, pointing a manicured, accusatory finger directly at Maddox. "The man sitting before you, Marcus Vance, is not a victim of circumstance. On the night of October 14th, he brutally and unprovokedly attacked Detective Holden Davenport during a routine traffic stop. He didn't just throw a punch. He drew a lethal, serrated switchblade and attempted to gut a decorated officer of the law. He is a menace, a violent opportunist, and a man who believes civil society does not apply to him." Ophelia shifted uncomfortably, leaning toward Maddox. "I'm going to object to the characterization," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Don't." Maddox replied softly, his baritone voice a calm, anchoring undercurrent beneath Lorelai's theatrics. Let her build her house of cards. The higher she builds it, the more spectacular the collapse. Ophelia blinked, startled by the sheer, unwavering authority radiating from a man who was facing 20 years in state prison. She swallowed hard, her objection dying in her throat, and sank back into her chair. Lorelai concluded her opening statement with a dramatic flourish, painting a vivid, entirely fictional picture of Maddox as an unhinged brute. It was a compelling narrative, supported by doctored police reports and a bloodied uniform that Holden Davenport had enthusiastically provided to the press. The prosecution calls Detective Holden Davenport to the stand, Lorelai announced, returning to her seat with a satisfied, venomous smirk. Holden sauntered down the center aisle of the courtroom. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick neck, a perpetually flushed face, and an aura of arrogant invincibility. His uniform was heavily starched, his silver badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. As he took the stand and raised his right hand to swear an oath to God, an oath he was about to desecrate entirely, he shot a look directly at Maddox. It was a look of pure, unadulterated racial and authoritative contempt. It was the look of a predator who firmly believed his prey was already dead and buried. State your name for the record, the bailiff said. Detective Holden Davenport. 88th Precinct. Vice and Narcotics. Lorelai approached the podium, resting her hands gracefully on the edges. Detective, can you walk us through the harrowing events of October 14th? For the next 45 minutes, Maddox sat back and listened to a masterclass in systemic perjury. Holden spun a gripping tale of heroic restraint. He described pulling over Maddox's vehicle for a broken taillight. Holden had smashed himself with a heavy steel flashlight. He described approaching the vehicle, only to be met with immediate, unprovoked hostility and a string of racial epithets allegedly spewed by Maddox. He was wild-eyed, completely irrational, like he was high on something, Holden testified, his voice dripping with faux somber gravity, playing the sympathetic victim perfectly. When I asked him to step out of the vehicle for officer safety, he lunged. He didn't just hit me. He pulled a matte black tactical switchblade from his jacket. He slashed at my face. I had to use necessary, immediate force to disarm him and save my own life. Violation of Title 18, U.S.C. Section 1621, Maddox catalogued mentally. Perjury. Violation of Title 18, U.S.C. Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Maddox's face remained an impenetrable abyss. He did not scowl. He did not shake his head in denial like a desperate, terrified man. His absolute, unnatural stillness began to unnerve Holden. The detective's eyes kept darting to the defense table, expecting anger, expecting fear, expecting something. Finding only a void of calm calculation, Holden's testimony grew slightly louder, his cadence slightly more defensive. He overcompensated, adding unnecessary flourishes to his lie. I feared for my life, Holden stated firmly, staring directly at the jury box, placing a hand over his heart. If I hadn't wrestled that knife away from him when I did, I wouldn't be breathing today. Judge Mira nodded sympathetically, completely buying the performance. Thank you for your service, Detective. Maddox leaned just a fraction of an inch toward Ophelia. His voice was a whisper that only she could hear, yet it carried the dense weight of an anvil. He's sweating from the left side of his brow. He's clenching his right fist on the armrest. He's lying, and the lack of reaction from me is causing microfractures in his confidence. Pass the witness. Do not cross-examine him yet. What? Ophelia hissed back, horrified, her eyes wide behind her glasses. If I don't poke holes in this weapon testimony now, the jury will cement their opinion. They think you're a slasher. Pass the witness, Ophelia, Maddox commanded gently. It wasn't a request. It was a direct order from a superior officer, though she didn't know it yet. Give them the rope. I need them to proudly display the noose before I pull the lever. Court is in recess for 1 hour, Judge Mira declared, banging her gavel with a lethargic, hollow thud before immediately reaching for her thermos. Maddox was swiftly handcuffed by 2 uniformed bailiffs and escorted out of the courtroom. He was led down a narrow, dimly lit concrete hallway toward the courthouse's temporary holding cells. The air down here was vastly different from the courtroom above. It tasted of rust, stale sweat, and institutional bleach. It was the distinct smell of broken men, silenced truths, and systemic despair. They locked him in cell block C, a small, caged room with a single, freezing metal bench and a perpetually dripping faucet in the corner. Maddox sat down, resting his cuffed hands squarely on his knees, his spine perfectly straight. He closed his eyes, using the momentary silence to run through the psychological profiles of his adversaries. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the algorithm of his trap. The heavy steel fire door at the far end of the corridor groaned open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed ominously on the concrete. Maddox didn't need to open his eyes to know who it was. The cheap, overpowering musk cologne and the heavy-footed swagger were a dead giveaway. Holden Davenport stood outside the heavy iron bars of the cell, flanking himself with the empty shadows of the basement. He was alone this time. Holden grinned, a greasy, self-satisfied expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and showcased his utter belief in his own invulnerability. "Comfortable in there, Vance?" Holden asked, gripping the iron bars tightly. "I got to admit, you got a lot of nerve not taking the plea deal. 10 years was a gift for a mutt like you. Now, with the deadly weapon charge, you're going away for 25, minimum." Maddox slowly opened his eyes, looking up at the detective. He let the silence stretch, forcing Holden to endure the awkward, heavy weight of a man who absolutely refused to be intimidated. As he looked at Holden, Maddox's gaze drifted down to the detective's left wrist. Gleaming against Holden's skin was a sleek, matte black, minimalist watch. It didn't look overly expensive to the untrained eye, but it was the exact watch Maddox had been wearing on the night of his arrest. Holden had pocketed it during the pat-down, casually stealing it off his suspect. "Cat got your tongue?" Holden sneered, pulling his sleeve back slightly to admire the stolen timepiece. "I have to say, for a street thug, you had decent taste in jewelry. Nice heavy metal. Looks better on me, though. Consider it a tax for making me do paperwork." Holden leaned closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a menacing, guttural whisper. "You know what your real problem is, boy? You don't know your place. You drive through my sector in a nice car, looking at me like you're somebody. I make the nobodies in this town, and I break them. I wrote the script for this trial before you even woke up in a cell. You have nothing." It was a gross, blatant display of the precise corruption Maddox had come to District 88 to systematically dismantle. Flashback, 72 hours ago. The subterranean level of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. was completely soundproof, heavily encrypted, and known only to a select few with Level 8 security clearance. Maddox Fairchild stood in front of a massive, glowing digital schematic of the city of Detroit, specifically isolating the geographic boundaries of the 88th Precinct. Estelle, his deputy director and most trusted confidant, stood beside him. She was a woman of fierce intellect, her silver hair pulled back into a severe bun, her tablet glowing softly in the low light of the war room. "The numbers are statistically impossible, Maddox," Estelle had said, swiping a finger across her screen to bring up a flurry of conviction rates and demographic charts. "Holden Davenport and his vice squad have a 98% closure rate on violent felonies. But if you look at the demographic breakdown, 94% of those convicted are black men with previous, minor records. No internal affairs investigations. No red flags from the local DA." Because the local DA is Lorelei Yardley, Maddox had replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She uses Davenport's fabricated arrests to pad her conviction stats for her upcoming run for state attorney general. Judge Mira rubber stamps the bogus warrants for a cut of the civil asset forfeitures. It's a closed loop of systemic predation. We have enough to send a federal probe right now," Estelle suggested, tapping her pen. "I can have 60 armed tactical agents raid the precinct tomorrow morning. We pull their hard drives, audit their evidence lockers." "No," Maddox interrupted sharply, turning to face her. "If we send a probe, the roaches scatter into the walls. They shred the files, they intimidate the witnesses, and the police union protects the worst offenders. They get paid administrative leave. The city pays a multi-million-dollar settlement using taxpayer money, and nothing actually changes. To tear down a house this rotten, you have to strike at the foundation from the inside. You have to let them think they caught you. Estelle had narrowed her eyes, a look of deep concern crossing her features. Maddox, no, you are the sitting director of the FBI. You cannot go under deep cover alone. It's against every operational protocol we have on the books. I don't care about protocol, Estelle, Maddox had said, his eyes burning with a cold, controlled fury. I care about the 62 innocent men currently sitting in state penitentiaries because Holden Davenport planted evidence on them to look like a hero. I need them to do it to me, on the record. Under oath, I need the prosecutor, the judge, and the cops all tied into the same inescapable RICO conspiracy. Estelle sighed heavily, knowing she couldn't stop him when his mind was set. They'll strip you of everything. They'll try to break you, physically and legally. They will confiscate all your belongings. Maddox had smiled thinly. I'm counting on it. Issue me the Cerberus unit. Disguise it as a wristwatch. If Davenport is as dirty as we think, he'll steal it for himself. Present time. Maddox looked at Holden through the bars, the memory fading into the harsh reality of the damp cell. The detective was still sneering, tapping the face of the stolen watch. Are you done, detective? Maddox asked calmly. His voice was incredibly smooth, completely devoid of any street slang or regional affectation Holden expected. It was the voice of an educated, powerful man holding a royal flush. Holden blinked, momentarily thrown off by the articulate precision of the response. He scowled, his face turning an ugly shade of red. You think you're smart? I've got the judge in my pocket, the DA doing my bidding, and the evidence right in front of the jury. You're a ghost. Actually, Maddox said, shifting his gaze directly to the watch on Holden's wrist. You're wearing my watch, detective. Holden laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Prove it, Vance. It's my word against a convict's. I don't need to prove it, Maddox replied, his voice dropping to a terrifying chill. That isn't a watch. It's a DARPA-engineered Cerberus biometric terminal. The moment you clasped it around your wrist, it locked onto your specific pulse signature. It cannot be unclasped without my fingerprint or cutting off your hand. Holden's laugh died instantly. He looked down at his wrist, suddenly pulling at the clasp. It didn't budge. It was solid titanium, fused shut. Furthermore, Maddox continued, taking a slow breath. Because you wore it into the precinct, it connected to your local Wi-Fi. It spent the last 48 hours mirroring every encrypted hard drive, every deleted text message on your personal phone, and every shadow ledger in the precinct server. It is currently live streaming your confession, right now, to a level 8 secure server in Washington, D.C. Holden froze. The color rapidly drained from his flushed face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He yanked at the watch furiously, his fingernails scraping uselessly against the indestructible metal. A tiny, previously invisible red light on the side of the watch began to blink slowly. You have no idea who you just put in a cage, Holden, Maddox whispered from the shadows. But you're about to find out. The courtroom had filled up to maximum capacity during the recess. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with off-duty police officers, friends of Holden, sitting in a silent, suffocating display of intimidation. They glared at Maddox as he was led back to the defense table, trying to mentally crush him with the sheer weight of their collective presence. Maddox ignored them entirely, treating the sea of hostile badges with the indifference one might afford a swarm of gnats. Ophelia was chewing nervously on the end of her pen. She noticed Holden Davenport sitting in the front row of the gallery. The detective looked completely unhinged. He was sweating profusely, his left hand shoved deep into his pocket, refusing to pull it out. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Court is back in session, Judge Mira announced, wiping a drop of condensation from her thermos. Prosecution, call your next witness to corroborate the physical evidence. Lorelei Yardley stood up, smoothing her flawless skirt. The prosecution calls Camille Ross to the stand. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the courtroom opened, and Camille walked in. She was a young woman, wearing the standard-issue polo shirt of the precinct's Evidence Management Division. She looked terrified, clutching a clear, sealed plastic evidence bag to her chest as if her life depended on it. Inside the bag rested a menacing, black tactical switchblade, stained with dried rust-colored spots that the prosecution claimed was Holden's blood. Maddox analyzed her immediately. Evidence custodian, young, highly susceptible to intimidation by senior detectives. Davenport forced her to falsify the chain of custody and swap whatever innocuous item I had for this prop weapon. She was the critical linchpin in their physical evidence narrative. Camille took the oath, her voice trembling so violently the microphone barely picked it up. She sat down, refusing to look in Maddox's direction, keeping her eyes glued to Lorelei. "Miss Ross," Lorelei began, her tone softening into an artificial, highly practiced empathy. "You are the head evidence technician for the 88th Precinct, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Camille whispered. "And you personally logged the weapon recovered from the scene of the assault on October 14th? Lorelei pointed to the plastic bag. "Can you identify the item in that bag for the jury?" Camille swallowed hard, her eyes darting briefly to Holden in the front row. Holden glared back at her, his jaw clenched tight. "It's a black switchblade. 3-inch serrated edge," Camille recited, her voice cracking. "I logged it into evidence. We ran prints and DNA, and whose fingerprints were perfectly preserved on the handle of that weapon. Miss Ross?" Lorelei pressed, stepping closer to the jury box to ensure they heard the damning conclusion. "The defendants, Marcus Vance," Camille said, hanging her head. "And the blood matched Detective Davenport." "Thank you, Miss Ross. The physical evidence speaks for itself," Lorelei said warmly, turning to the defense table with a victorious, supremely arrogant smile. "Your witness." Ophelia stood up. Her hands were shaking. She had nothing. The testimony was devastating, and the physical weapon sitting on the railing of the witness stand was a nail in the coffin. Maddox reached out, his cuffed hands resting lightly on the wooden table. "Ophelia," he murmured. She leaned down, her face pale. "Maddox, I can't break this. It's physical forensics. We're dead in the water." "Do exactly as I say," Maddox instructed, his voice dropping an octave into a hypnotic, commanding register. "Walk to the podium. Ask her to read the serial number etched into the base of the blade. Then, I am going to give you a 6-digit alphanumeric code. Read it out loud, clearly, directly toward the microphone." "A code? What is a code going to do?" Ophelia whispered back, frantic. "Just do it." Ophelia took a deep, shuddering breath, walked to the podium, and offered Camille a tentative look. "Miss Ross, I have a question about the weapon you're holding." Lorelei rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair. "Could you please look closely at the base of the blade, right above the hilt, and read the serial number stamped into the metal?" Ophelia asked. Camille looked confused. She lifted the plastic bag, squinting through the plastic at the dark metal. It says Proto V88. Maddox sat up just a fraction of an inch, his eyes locked onto the knife. "Thank you," Ophelia said, looking back at Maddox. He nodded once. Ophelia turned back to the microphone, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "Alpha, Tango, 7, 4, Niner, Omega." For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Lorelei let out a loud, mocking scoff. "Your Honor, is the defense attempting to cast a magic spell on the evidence?" Suddenly, a high-pitched, electronic ping sliced through the courtroom. Everyone froze. The sound came directly from the plastic bag in Camille's hands. Ping, ping, ping. A tiny, previously invisible LED light, embedded in the hilt of the black switchblade, began to flash a brilliant, piercing federal blue. Camille shrieked and dropped the bag onto the wooden railing. The knife continued to flash and ping, a digital beacon illuminating the stunned courtroom. Holden Davenport leaped out of his seat in the gallery, his face a mask of absolute terror, his left hand still trapped in his pocket. "Turn it off," he yelled, losing all composure. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Mira demanded, half standing behind her bench, staring at the flashing weapon. "That, Your Honor," Ophelia said, her voice suddenly finding a booming, unshakable confidence as she realized what Maddox had done, "is not a street weapon. That is an actively transmitting, microchipped prototype tracking blade engineered specifically for the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom, broken only by the rhythmic ping of the compromised evidence. "Miss Ross," Ophelia continued, her eyes blazing as she looked at the terrified evidence clerk. "How exactly did Marcus Vance's fingerprints get on a highly classified, restricted federal tracking device that he never touched? Who gave you that knife to put in the bag?" Camille began to hyperventilate on the stand. She looked at the judge, then at Lorelai's shocked face, and finally at Holden, who was backing away toward the courtroom doors. I, Camille gasped, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed the microphone, completely breaking under the pressure. "He made me do it. Detective Davenport gave me the knife. He brought it from his own car. He told me he took it off the suspect and told me to stamp Vance's old prints from a prior file onto the report. I never tested the blood. He threatened to deport my mother if I didn't fake the log." The courtroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. The gallery of cops surged to their feet, shouting over each other. Lorelai was screaming objections that made no sense. Judge Mira was violently hammering her gavel, her face red with sudden, career-ending panic. Through the sheer, deafening chaos of the collapsing conspiracy, Maddox Fairchild remained perfectly still. He slowly leaned back in his wooden chair, adjusting his cuffs, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips as the trap violently snapped shut. The rhythmic, damning ping of the FBI tracking blade echoed beneath the cacophony of shouting police officers, a shrieking witness, and a frantic judge. Holden Davenport didn't think. He reacted with the pure, primal instinct of a cornered predator realizing it had stepped into a steel trap. His face, moments ago flushed with arrogant triumph, was now a sickly, pallid gray. He shoved past the off-duty officers in the front row, his heavy boots scrambling for traction against the polished hardwood floor. "Get out of my way," Holden roared, violently pushing a fellow detective aside. He made a desperate, wild sprint toward the heavy double-oak doors at the back of the courtroom. His left hand was still jammed furiously into his pocket, hiding the titanium biometric watch that was currently broadcasting his heartbeat and his financial crimes directly to Washington. At the defense table, Maddox Fairchild remained seated. He didn't shout, he didn't flinch. He simply tracked Holden's panicked flight with cold, unblinking eyes. "Bailiff, stop him. Clear the gallery," Judge Mira screamed, her gavel cracking so hard against the sound block that a splinter of wood flew into the air. But the bailiff, a man who had taken bribes from Holden for a decade, simply froze, his hand hovering uselessly over his holster. The gallery of cops, usually a unified wall of blue intimidation, fractured into confusion. Some yelled at Holden to stop, others stepped back, instinctively distancing themselves from a sinking ship. Holden hit the double doors with his shoulder, throwing his entire weight against the heavy wood, expecting to burst out into the freedom of the municipal hallway. Instead, he bounced off a wall of black Kevlar. The doors swung inward with bone-jarring force, throwing Holden backward onto the floor. Standing in the threshold was not the empty hallway he expected, but a phalanx of 12 heavily armored FBI tactical agents. Their tactical rifles were at low ready, their faces obscured by ballistic helmets and visors. The letters FBI were emblazoned in stark, uncompromising yellow across their tactical vests. Stepping fluidly through the center of the tactical formation was Estelle. She wore a tailored navy trench coat over a sharp pantsuit, her silver hair pulled back with severe precision. In one hand, she held a tablet, in the other, a stack of sealed federal warrants thick enough to choke a horse. She surveyed the utter chaos of the courtroom with a look of profound, aristocratic distaste. "Nobody moves." Estelle's voice wasn't a shout, but it possessed a terrifying, amplified clarity that immediately silenced the room. It was the voice of absolute, unquestionable federal authority. Holden scrambled backward on the floor, like a crab, his eyes wide with a terror he had only ever inflicted on others. "This is my jurisdiction," he sputtered, spit flying from his lips. "You can't do this. I'm a decorated detective." Two tactical agents stepped forward, hauling Holden off the floor by his armpits with effortless, mechanical force. They slammed him face-first against the nearest mahogany pew, kicking his legs apart. "Detective Holden Davenport," Estelle said calmly, walking down the center aisle, her heels clicking in perfect rhythm. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit perjury, deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, in violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. I have immunity, Holden shrieked, his cheek pressed painfully against the wood. Lorelei, tell them I'm acting under the authority of the district attorney. Lorelei Yardley, standing at the prosecution table, looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her immaculate composure had evaporated. Seeing the federal agents, she instantly calculated the survival odds and made her pivot. I have no idea what he is talking about, Lorelei shouted, her voice trembling but desperately trying to project authority. She pointed a perfectly manicured, shaking finger at Holden. The district attorney's office was fed falsified information by a rogue, corrupt officer. We were deceived. We demand his immediate arrest. Maddox let out a low, dark chuckle from the defense table. It was the first sound he had made since the chaos erupted. The sound cut through the tension like a razor. Estelle stopped at the defense table. She looked down at Maddox, who was still sitting calmly with his hands cuffed. "Status, Director?" Estelle asked, her tone shifting from intimidating to respectful. Ophelia, the young defense attorney, slowly turned her head. Her jaw went completely slack. Her eyes darted from the terrifying woman with the FBI strike team down to the quiet, imposing man sitting next to her in the cheap suit. "Director?" Ophelia whispered, the word barely making it past her lips. "Director of what?" "Status is green, Deputy Director," Maddox replied smoothly, his baritone voice filling the stunned silence of the room. He held up his bound hands. "Though I would appreciate it if someone could locate the keys. These state-issued cuffs are chafing my wrists." Estelle snapped her fingers. An agent immediately stepped forward with a master key, unlocking the heavy steel cuffs. The loud clack of the restraints falling to the table sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Maddox stood up. He rolled his shoulders, adjusting the cuffs of his cheap shirt. He didn't look like an unemployed drifter anymore. The subtle shift in his posture, the commanding lift of his chin, and the sheer, overwhelming gravity of his presence instantly transformed the room. He was no longer the prey. He was the apex predator, and he had just locked the cage from the inside. What is the meaning of this outrage? Judge Mira finally found her voice, though it cracked with an underlying hysteria. She gripped her gavel as if it were a life preserver. "This is a state courtroom. You do not have jurisdiction to interrupt an active criminal trial with an armed federal strike team. I will hold every single one of you in contempt." Maddox turned his dark, penetrating gaze upon the bench. The sheer intensity of his stare caused Judge Mira to physically recoil in her high-backed leather chair. "You don't have a courtroom anymore, Mira," Maddox said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder. "And you certainly don't have the moral or legal authority to hold anyone in contempt." Mira's face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. "Bailiff, remove this man. Case dismissed. The case against Marcus Vance is dismissed with prejudice. Everyone out of my courtroom." It was a desperate, transparent attempt to sweep the grenade under the rug before it detonated. If the case was dismissed, she reasoned, the federal agents would have to leave, and she could begin shredding documents in her chambers. "I refuse your dismissal," Maddox stated, stepping out from behind the defense table and walking slowly toward the center of the room. "You can't refuse a dismissal," Lorelei Yardley snapped, suddenly trying to align herself with the judge to salvage the wreckage. "The state drops the charges. You're free to go, Mr. Vance. Leave." "My name," Maddox said, stopping in the exact center of the room, projecting his voice so it echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, "is Maddox Fairchild. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I am not leaving until every single rat in this building is in federal custody." A collective gasp sucked the remaining air out of the room. In the gallery, the off-duty cops who had come to mock him were now shrinking into their seats, desperately avoiding eye contact, praying their faces hadn't been captured on the courtroom cameras. Ophelia sank into her chair, covering her mouth with both hands, hyperventilating as she realized she had just spent 3 days trying to explain basic legal concepts to the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the United States. Judge Mira's hands began to shake violently. The thermos on her desk tipped over, spilling a clear liquid that smelled strongly of gin across her case files. Director Fairchild," she stammered, her arrogant facade completely dissolving into a puddle of terror. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. If I had known, if you had known who I was, you would have treated me with the deference you reserve for your wealthy donors, Maddox interrupted, his voice slicing through her pathetic excuses. But because I was a black man in a cheap suit, you didn't even bother to look up from your paperwork, while your prosecutor and your detective conspired to bury me alive. Maddox turned to Estelle. Deputy Director, read the Honorable Judge her secondary charges. Estelle tapped her tablet, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. Judge Mira Linwood, we have secured the ledgers from the Cayman Island offshore accounts registered under your sister's maiden name. We have traced exactly $1.4 million in civil asset forfeiture kickbacks directly from the 88th Precinct's Narcotics Division into those accounts over the last 4 years. Mira gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. No, that's sealed. That's protected data. Nothing is sealed from me, Maddox said softly. You rubber-stamped fraudulent, no-knock warrants for Holden Davenport. He raided innocent homes, seized their cash and property under bogus drug suspicions, and funneled 20% of it into your re-election fund and offshore trusts. You didn't just preside over a corrupt court, Mira. You actively monetized the destruction of my community. You entrapped us. Mira shrieked, tears of sheer panic ruining her mascara. This is a setup. No, Your Honor, Maddox corrected her, his expression utterly devoid of mercy. Entrapment implies I coerced you into committing a crime you were not already predisposed to commit. I didn't coerce you. I simply provided you with a mirror. And you gleefully showed me exactly who you are. He gestured to 2 FBI agents standing near the front row. Take her. The agents bypassed the wooden gate, ascended the steps to the bench, and grabbed Judge Mira by the arms of her robes. She kicked and screamed, thrashing wildly as they dragged her down from her elevated perch, the symbol of her false authority crashing down with her. The metallic click of federal handcuffs snapping around the wrists of a sitting judge echoed like a definitive, final judgment. The courtroom was now completely under federal control. The exits were blocked by heavily armed tactical units. The gallery of local police officers had been ordered to place their hands on the pews in front of them, sitting in terrified silence as federal agents went row by row, confiscating badges, service weapons, and cell phones. Holden Davenport was already gone, dragged out to a waiting armored transport vehicle, his stolen biometric watch permanently fused to his wrist, serving as his own walking, ticking confession. Judge Mira was hyperventilating in a holding chair, completely broken. Lorelei Yardley remained standing at the prosecution table. She was a survivor. She had climbed the political ladder by stepping on the throats of the weak, and she wasn't about to go down without playing her final, desperate hand. She smoothed her skirt, forced her breathing to steady, and looked at Maddox. Her predatory eyes calculated a new angle. Director Fairchild, Lorelei said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register, a stark contrast to her earlier theatrical shouting. May we speak, privately? Maddox looked at her. He saw right through the veneer of composed professionalism to the desperate, cornered animal underneath. He nodded slightly. Estelle, secure the room. Miss Yardley and I will use the judge's chambers. Lorelei practically sprinted to the heavy mahogany door behind the bench, desperate to get out of the public eye. Maddox followed her, his footsteps silent, his posture relaxed. The judge's chambers smelled heavily of the spilled gin from the courtroom and old leather. The walls were lined with law books that had clearly never been opened. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, Lorelei dropped the Ice Queen persona. She stepped close to Maddox, looking up at him with wide, pleading eyes. Listen to me, Maddox. Can I call you Maddox? She asked, her voice trembling with manufactured vulnerability. I am a victim of the police union here. Davenport and the chief of police, they feed me the cases. I don't investigate them. I just prosecute what lands on my desk. If I don't play ball, they ruin my career. Maddox leaned against the edge of the judge's heavy oak desk, crossing his arms. He didn't say a word. He just let her dig. I can be incredibly valuable to you, Lorelei pressed, stepping even closer, her perfume cloying in the small room. I know where all the bodies are buried. I know the mayor's slush funds. I know which state senators are taking cartel money to look the other way on the shipping ports. Give me full, blanket immunity, and I will hand you the entire state political infrastructure on a silver platter. I will be your star witness." She reached out, gently placing a manicured hand on his forearm. "We are both ambitious people, Director. We know how the game is played. Let me help you win." Maddox looked down at her hand, resting on his arm. Then, he looked up into her eyes. There was no anger in his gaze. There was only a cold, abyssal void that terrified her more than any shouting match ever could. "You fundamentally misunderstand the game we are playing, Miss Yardley," Maddox said softly. He didn't pull his arm away. He simply let her feel the tension in his muscles. "You think this is a negotiation. You think you possess leverage." Lorelei swallowed hard, her confidence beginning to splinter. "I have the files." "You have nothing," Maddox corrected her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted federal smartphone. He tapped the screen once and held it up for her to see. On the screen was a live, high-definition drone feed. It showed the exterior of the district attorney's office downtown. The building was surrounded by a fleet of black SUVs. Federal agents were carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes and computer servers out of the front doors, loading them into armored trucks. Lorelei gasped, stumbling backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "While you were busy in courtroom 304, enthusiastically trying to send an innocent black man to a maximum security prison for 20 years, Maddox explained, his voice devoid of any emotion, "a team of 75 forensic accountants and cyber agents simultaneously raided your offices. We already have the mayor's slush funds. We have the port manifests. And we have your private, encrypted emails instructing your junior prosecutors to withhold exculpatory evidence from public defenders in over 300 felony cases." Lorelei's legs gave out. She slumped against the leather sofa, her perfect posture crumbling into a heap of designer fabric and shattered ambition. "No, please. I'll be disbarred. I'll go to prison." "Yes, you will," Maddox confirmed. He stood up from the desk, straightening his cheap jacket, which now looked like a king's armor. "You built a career on the destroyed lives of men who didn't have the power to fight back. You thought the system you corrupted would protect you. But you forgot one crucial detail, Lorelei." She looked up at him, tears of genuine despair ruining her face. "What?" Maddox walked to the door, placing his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at her, his eyes blazing with a righteous, terrifying fire. "I am the system." He opened the door and stepped back into the courtroom. Two agents immediately brushed past him, entering the chambers to cuff the sobbing district attorney. Maddox walked back to the defense table, where Ophelia was still sitting, paralyzed with awe. He gently tapped the table to get her attention. "Counselor," Maddox said, offering her the first genuine, warm smile he had shown since arriving in the city. "I believe our business here is concluded. However, the FBI is always looking for principled, relentless defense attorneys to run our internal oversight division in Washington. When the dust settles here, expect a phone call." Ophelia could only nod, tears of relief and shock pooling in her eyes. Maddox Fairchild turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, the sea of federal agents parting for him, leaving the burning wreckage of the 88th Precinct's corruption in his wake. Inside a sterile, windowless FBI interrogation room, Holden Davenport sat shackled to a steel table. Stripped of his badge and swagger, he looked small and pitiful in a scratchy orange federal jumpsuit. His stolen biometric watch was still fused to his wrist, its blue LED blinking relentlessly. Maddox Fairchild entered, shedding his drifter disguise for a bespoke, midnight blue suit. The invisible aura of power he possessed in the courtroom was now fully unleashed. "You can't keep me here. I want my union rep," Holden rasped, tugging uselessly at his chains. "Arrested 45 minutes ago," Maddox replied smoothly, stopping behind Holden's chair. "You are entirely alone." Holden swallowed hard, panic overriding his pride. "I'll give you the chief of police. The mayor. I have their ledgers." The chief resigned and is cooperating. "We already audited the mayor's accounts," Maddox said, his gaze unwavering. Desperate, Holden offered his millions in untraceable offshore accounts. In response, Maddox simply clicked a remote, turning on a wall monitor. It showed Holden's wife in another room, frantically signing a stack of legal documents alongside federal prosecutors. She took full immunity, surrendered all claims to your illicit assets, and filed for divorce. Maddox explained coldly. Holden stared at the screen, tears of absolute, profound defeat spilling over his eyelashes. His money was gone, his career ended, and his family had abandoned him. He was completely dismantled. In a high-security federal holding facility, Lorelei Yardley used her single permitted phone call to frantically dial Governor Arthur Sterling. "Arthur, I need a preemptive executive pardon right now," she hissed into the receiver. "If I go down, I am exposing the port contracts and the zoning board bribes." A terrifyingly familiar baritone answered her. "Hello, Miss Yardley." Lorelei's blood turned to ice water. "Maddox? I am currently sitting in the governor's private office." "He just heard your entire extortion attempt on speakerphone," Maddox said pleasantly. Lorelei collapsed against her cell wall, the phone slipping from her trembling fingers. Across the state, Governor Sterling shakily signed a full confession and immediate resignation to avoid public racketeering indictments, his political dynasty ending with a single stroke of ink. Simultaneously, Judge Mira Linwood faced her own apocalypse. She was marched through the downtown courthouse lobby in handcuffs, weeping uncontrollably as reporters swarmed her. A visiting federal magistrate set her bail at exactly $1.4 million, the precise amount she had stolen in kickbacks. With all her assets frozen by the FBI, the corrupt judge was remanded to a thin, lumpy mattress in the very county jail she had ruthlessly filled for years. 6 months later, the harsh winter had thawed, giving way to a bright, crisp spring morning in District 88. The neighborhood looked different. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere of fear that used to cling to the streets had lifted. The 88th Precinct building itself had undergone a massive overhaul. The imposing, militaristic barricades out front had been removed, replaced with community outreach bulletin boards. Inside, the department was under strict, daily federal consent decrees. Nearly 60% of the old force had been fired, indicted, or forced into early retirement. A new, progressive captain had been installed, working closely with federal liaisons. A sleek black government SUV pulled up to the curb outside a newly opened community center, funded entirely by the liquidated assets of Holden Davenport and Judge Mira's offshore accounts. Maddox Fairchild stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp, understated gray suit, his demeanor calm and observant. He walked into the community center, the smell of fresh paint and brewing coffee filling the air. At the front desk, organizing a stack of after-school program flyers, was Camille Ross. She looked like a completely different person. The terrified, hollow-eyed evidence clerk who had been blackmailed into perjury was gone. In her place was a vibrant, healthy young woman, her eyes bright and focused. She was part of a federal witness rehabilitation program, given a second chance, a clean record, and a purpose. She looked up and gasped softly. "Director Fairchild." "Hello, Camille," Maddox said, offering a warm, genuine smile. "I see the new center is thriving." "It is," she said, coming around the desk, her hands clasped in front of her. "The kids, they actually have a safe place to go now. The police officers who walk the beat here now, they actually talk to us. They don't just stare at us like we're targets." She paused, her eyes welling with grateful tears. "You saved my life, sir. You saved my brother's life. You saved yourself, Camille," Maddox corrected her gently. "In that courtroom, when the pressure was at its absolute peak, you chose to tell the truth. That takes more courage than carrying a badge." Maddox nodded respectfully and walked down the hallway, entering a makeshift legal clinic at the back of the center. Sitting behind a desk piled high with thick legal folders was Ophelia. She was no longer a frantic, overwhelmed public defender. She wore a sharp, professional blazer, her glasses perched confidently on her nose. She had accepted Maddox's offer. As a newly minted Special Assistant United States Attorney, she was heading up the Exoneration Task Force, systematically reviewing and throwing out hundreds of fraudulent convictions tied to the 88th Precinct. "Director," Ophelia said, standing up with a bright smile. To what do I owe the pleasure of an unannounced inspection? I was in the city finalizing the governor's plea deal, Maddox said, taking a seat across from her. I wanted to see the front lines. How goes the battle, counselor? Ophelia tapped a massive stack of folders on her left. 32 innocent men released this week alone. We're securing compensation packages for all of them from the city's liability insurance. Holden Davenport's entire legacy is being erased, case by case. And Davenport himself? Maddox asked, already knowing the answer, but wanting to hear it. Transferred to ADX Florence, Ophelia replied, referring to the most secure supermax prison in the country. 23 hours a day of lockdown. No contact with the outside world. Lorelei Yardley took a 15-year plea to avoid a trial, and Judge Mira is currently scrubbing cafeteria floors at a federal facility in Ohio. Maddox nodded slowly, looking out the window of the clinic at the neighborhood below. Children were playing on a newly built basketball court. A patrol car drove by slowly, the officer inside waving at a local shop owner. It wasn't perfect. Systemic change never was. But the rot had been excised, and the healing had begun. The system is a machine, Ophelia, Maddox said softly, his dark eyes reflecting the sunlight. When it is operated by the corrupt, it crushes the innocent. But when it is wielded by those who actually revere justice, it can rebuild the world. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. Keep up the good work, counselor. The Bureau is watching. Maddox Fairchild walked out of the community center and back into his waiting SUV. As the vehicle pulled away, blending into the city traffic, the director of the FBI looked down at his wrist. The titanium biometric Cerberus watch had been replaced by a simple, elegant silver timepiece. The time for traps was over. The time for justice had arrived. What happens when corrupt power brokers try to break the very man who designed the system that hunts them? They trigger an avalanche they cannot stop. Holden Davenport, Lorelei Yardley, and Judge Mira thought they were the untouchable kings and queens of their city. They believed their badges and gavels were shields against consequence. But Maddox Fairchild proved that absolute corruption will eventually meet absolute, unyielding justice. They dug a grave for an innocent man, only to be buried in it themselves, stripped of their wealth, their power, and their freedom. If you love this story of brutal, satisfying karma and brilliant tactical justice, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more intense, dramatic stories of revenge and redemption, and share this video with anyone who loves seeing corrupt bullies get exactly what they deserve. Let me know in the comments which twist was your favorite. Until next time, stay vigilant.